Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first seminar in the history of collecting of 2021. Before we start, I just wanted to check that everything is working and just give some housekeeping rules. So this seminar will be recorded, so please stay muted and with your cameras off throughout. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. And at the end of the talk, which will last approximately 45 minutes, we will have a Q&A session. Now, Suzanne, you can present Arthur.
Thanks very much, Natalia. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to reiterate Natalia's welcome to the Wallace Collection's first seminar in the history of collecting for 2021. Although we're still in very challenging times, there are auspicious signs of better times ahead. And so I wish you a happy and healthy new year. I'm Suzanne Higgett. I'm one of the curators at the Wallace Collection, and I'm delighted to introduce this evening's speaker, my colleague, Arthur Bale. Arthur is Assistant Curator of Ottoman, Middle Eastern and Asian Arms and Armour at the Wallace Collection. He graduated from Oxford University with a BA in Arabic and Islamic Studies. In 2017, Arthur completed his MA at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. His MA dissertation was on Orthodox Shiite visual responses to messianic expectations in mid-19th century Iran. He's currently working on the Wallace Collection's forthcoming catalogue of arms and armour from India, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. During and after Arthur's talk, please send in any questions you have for Arthur through the Q&A. It's my pleasure to invite Arthur to present his lecture, Marbles in Lucknow, the Aesthetics of Ajab in the Art Collection of Asaf al-Dawla. Over to you, Arthur.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you so much, Natalia, for introducing me. And also thank you so much for having me with the history of collecting. I would like to take this opportunity to talk about Asaf al-Dawla. And if we can go to the next slide, we have him here in a sketch by the German artist Johann Zoffany. And I'll talk more about Zoffany later, but you may know him from his dealings with George III, so he's very popular in England especially. What I want to talk about specifically tonight is the art collection of Asaf al-Dawla. If we can move to the next slide, we've got Asaf al-Dawla, who was the ruler of the city of Lucknow, right in the middle of this map. The ruler of the city of Lucknow and then the region of Awadh, which corresponds with the yellowed area of this map. And if you want to know where this is roughly in India today, it corresponds mostly with the province of Uttar Pradesh. And for reference, in the top left corner of this map, you've got the city of Delhi. So that kind of orients you a little bit. It's a very large area and a very wealthy area in the last quarter of the 18th century, which is when Asaf al-Dawla reigned. And if we go to the next slide, we've got, yes. So he reigned from 1775 to 1797. So really pretty much exactly the last quarter of the 18th century. And this was a time when the Mughal Empire, which of course based in Delhi, at this point it had declined in quite a significant way. Delhi was a place that had been extremely rich and extremely powerful throughout the 17th century, but gone on a gradual decline. It's been sacked in the first half of the 18th century and gradually declined over the course of the 18th century. And then, of course, in the 19th century, you've got the British East India Company and then later the British Raj, which were very powerful in India. And so Asaf al-Dawla is really kind of in between the two. And overall, history has not been very kind to him. He's been frequently described as a kind of a dim, decadent ruler who made such a mess of governing his own domain that the British East India Company was forced to intervene and to turn him into, and his successors into puppet rulers, really. To give you an idea of how lowly he was considered by his British contemporaries and near contemporaries, so people writing in the early 19th century. It was claimed that in the Calcutta press, it was claimed that Asaf al-Dawla squandered every rupee he could extort from his ministers. So he's really considered quite corrupt. And another observer said of him, Asaf ad-Dawla possessed no great mental powers, but at least his heart was good. So these are not very positive views on him as a person. And more importantly, John Shore, who was the Governor General during the last 4 years of Asaf ad-Dawla's reign, he thought that while Asaf ad-Dawla was naturally good, he was corrupted by bad advisors, mean associates, and absolute power, which John Shore was willing to concede he did not exercise cruelly. And his predecessor, Wallace, his predecessor in the post, largely agreed with that assessment. So he's really negatively viewed. And unfortunately, this idea of Asaf ad-Dawla as this kind of decadent and dumb puppet of company interests, it remained largely unchallenged by historians throughout the 19th and the 20th century. But more recently, it has been recognized that actually by 1796, so a year before Asaf ad-Dawla died, and kind of towards the end of his reign, he had achieved almost complete autonomy from both the Mughal emperors, to whom he owed nominal allegiance, and the British East India Company. And actually, this was a really impressive feat in very many ways. So in the last few decades, serious question marks have been placed around this idea of Asaf ad-Dawla as being this decadent and dumb puppet of the company, and actually portraying him now as a much more capable, much more diplomatic individual than previous generations of historians had given him credit for, and actually of being capable of effectively leveraging his relationship with the British East India Company for his own ends. So this kind of change in historiography, which in large part can be attributed to a more critical approach to previous company records, who of course were not neutral in their description of him, and also better access to contemporary local records. So if a lot of work has been done in recent years to kind of salvage Asaf ad-Dawla's reputation as a ruler, very little has been done on his art collection. And his art collection, like his person, were also dismissed by contemporary Europeans. It was considered tasteless, and by extension, the tastelessness of his art collection was considered kind of evidence of the fact that he was not very smart and that he lacked sophistication, he lacked intelligence, he was not able to, he didn't have the capability of being a good ruler. So given that we've seen such a change in the perception of Asaf ad-Dawla as a ruler, when I kind of came across this, starting out in my research, I suspected that there was more to the kind of the traditional narrative of his art collection being something that, while it consisted of very expensive items, wasn't very well put together. It wasn't curated. It was just there to make the owner look rich. And I am thinking essentially, my hypothesis became that European visitors maybe misunderstood the nature of his art collection and of his collecting habits, because they did not quite understand the motivations behind his art collection, or the taste of the ruling class in Awadh. And they were understandably, of course, looking at the art collection from a very, very European British point of view. And I think if this is the case, and I will argue, of course, that it is the case, I believe that a better understanding of the taste and the collecting habits of Asaf ad-Dawla and of his courtiers, of course. So in other words, why certain works of art are popular, why certain other works of art which may have been popular in the past were no longer popular, or produced outside of Lucknow and also not very popular. Why this understanding of taste this understanding of taste may provide us with further insights into the art being produced in Lucknow at the time, and as well, of course, being interesting in its own right, I think, which is, of course, a very valid reason to look into it as well. And furthermore, this is of special interest to me as the assistant curator of at the Wallace collection, because the Wallace collection is home to an incredible group of late 18th and early 19th century fine swords, and we'll see some of those in the presentation, as well as a number of other works of art, which were either produced in Awadh during the late 18th century or early 19th century, or were present there. So they were not made there, but we know that they passed through, which again says a lot about the taste as well. And I think it's worth kind of elaborating a little bit on that second point, because when considering the taste of Asaf ad-Dawla's court, it is essential that we don't just look at what's being produced at that point, but also what kind of objects, what kind of works of art are being imported, either or being preserved essentially locally. So what you see is significant number of European art imports. You see Chinese objects being imported in great numbers, and a large group of objects are actually Mughal objects from the 16th and 17th century, which came from Delhi when Delhi declined. And the most prominent example of that in our collection is this early 17th century Mughal dagger, which was almost certainly made in Delhi. And those of you who visited the Wallace Collections exhibition, Forgotten Masters, last year, it ran up until essentially we had to close for the COVID pandemic. And the exhibition was on so-called company school painting. But this was kind of the opening piece to that exhibition, and it's a really high quality dagger. All the red gems are rubies, the green gems are all emeralds, and the kind of the translucent stone of the handle, that's one piece of rock crystal. So it's extremely valuable. It was made in the early 17th century, in Delhi, most likely. But the reason it's important here is because we know that it was owned by Claude Martin, and he was a Frenchman in the employ of the British East India Company, who had a particularly close, he really cultivated a close relationship with Asaf ad-Dawla, while at the same time, of course, using his position to amass vast amount of wealth. And it really were vast amount of wealth, even to kind of British East India Company standards. And importantly, he was also a major patron of European and Indian artists in the city, and he was superintendent of Asaf ad-Dawla's armory. And there's good reason for us to believe that Claude Martin was either given this dagger by someone in Asaf ad-Dawla's court, or sold it, given that he was so wealthy. And here we've got a drawing of him by Zoffany again. So we'll see Zoffany again and again in this presentation. I'll talk more about him later. So if we go to the next slide. So unfortunately, and this is really unfortunate, I think, I've yet to come across a painting or a drawing or any kind of visual evidence of Asaf ad-Dawla's art collection. We know from numerous textual references that it existed as a baseline, and it was housed in a private part of his palace known as the ainakhaneh, which means the house of mirrors. And but other than that, we don't really have very much in terms of visual references. So as a starting point, when talking about Asaf ad-Dawla's art collection, I want to start with the descriptions of the collection by European travelers at the time, European visitors to his palace. And the reason I want to start with European accounts, as opposed to, for example, local accounts in Persian or Urdu, is because these European accounts are really the ones that have formed subsequent scholarship. So everything we know about his art collection at the moment, anything that's been published, it's been really strongly grounded on these accounts. And if we move to the next slide, we have, as I mentioned earlier, so this is one of the swords in our collection, really a fantastic work of enamel. As I mentioned earlier, contemporary European accounts were not kind. One Englishman, a certain Elf Smith, said the following of Asaf ad-Dawla's ainakhaneh. the amount said to be annually expended on these purchases would exceed belief if the extreme childishness of Asaf al-Dawla in things of this sort were not notorious. Indeed, it was impossible to see without pain and shame the evidence which the ainakhaneh alone afforded of the weakness and the extravagance of Asaf al-Dawla, and of the dishonorable cupidity and deception with which this injurious dissipation was encouraged principally by British subjects at the expense of the poor inhabitants of Awadh. And accounts by other European visitors generally are not very different. I like citing L.F. Smith because his account is one of the longest and one of the more colorful ones. A lot of the other ones are very kind of basic, very much just kind of stating the facts rather than having a kind of a personal, and in this case, I think also a moral response to the collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about that moral response later on in the thing, because I think it's quite relevant. So what stood out to me in all of these accounts is there's something quite interesting going on, because there are actually uniformly negative about the ainakhaneh. There's not a single account that's overall positive about it. People may say positive things about it, but the overall account is always negative. And the interesting thing that stood out to me is that while these accounts are all negative, the actual art in the collection is described positively. So there are most commentators, and these are the very same commentators, they describe some of the individual works of art in the collection with great admiration, and they're really impressed by these works of art. And I want to show one of those objects here, which is the famous, this is just one I want to highlight, it's the famous Padshah manuscript produced in the mid-17th century for the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. And this manuscript is currently in the Royal Collection at Windsor. And we know we know the exact provenance of this manuscript, and it's actually one of the few works of art that we know was an Asaf al-Dawla's collection, and we can trace it to the present day quite easily. So that's one of the reasons why I show it to you here. And this manuscript, and anyone who's ever seen it in person will know just how impressive it is. It's really worth seeing. It was purchased by Asaf al-Dawla for a sum of 12,000 rupees, which was about 1,550 pounds at the time. And that is a truly obscene amount of money for reference. It's always quite difficult to judge how much, historic sums of money are. But to give you an idea, it is far more than anyone ever spent at London auctions for a single painting, for example. And it's the kind of money that would buy you a small country house rather than just one object. But Asaf al-Dawla paid this kind of money just for this manuscript. And just to give you a bit more information about that provenance, this manuscript stayed in the collection of Asaf al-Dawla until he died. And shortly after his death, it was his successor, actually, who presented it to the Governor General, John Shore, who in turn presented it to George III. And that's why it's in the Royal Collection and why it's at Windsor now. So we move on. At the same time, he was also presented with this manuscript. It's a different manuscript, and it's a manuscript of the Khamsa of Navai, which had likewise come from the Imperial Mughal Library, and which Shah Jahan himself, so the patron of the previous album, and also the patron of Taj Mahal, for those who don't know who Shah Jahan is, really an iconic ruler in Indian history. And Shah Jahan described this particular manuscript as one of my most treasured books. So again, these are the absolute best examples of Indian art available in India at the time. So of course we know about the provenance of these objects. We don't really know the exact objects that were otherwise in his collection, but we do know, based on the general descriptions by European visitors, that this is representative of the best objects in the art collection. And European visitors regularly comment on, for example, exceptional quality of timepieces, of chandeliers, of all these kinds of objects. And really what they're taking issue with, what they're lamenting, is that they are displayed along things which are, in their description, in their eyes, thoroughly ordinary. And by the way, if anyone knows of any timepieces with a known Asaf al-Dawla provenance, I would love to hear about them, because I haven't been able to find any actual objects yet. So in any case, it seems that a kind of a close reading of the visitors' accounts suggests that the problem European visitors had with Asaf al-Dawla's collection in the ainakhaneh was not so much the contents of it and the quality of the individual objects, but rather the undiscerning appreciation of these works of art, the way they were displayed, the way they felt they were appreciated. It was considered kind of wrong, essentially. And tellingly, I think, the same L.F. Smith that I quoted earlier, his account describes Asaf al-Dawla as playing with his toys with a childlike fascination, which really is quite a demeaning way of speaking about the ruler of a really quite a large kingdom. So what has, and that's all the primary accounts, but what has the secondary scholarship said so far? What have people been writing about the collection? So, as I mentioned earlier, very little work has been done specifically on the art collection of Asaf al-Dawla, and usually it's mentioned in accounts of his life and engagement with his person as a politician, but often it's not really more than that. I do, however, want to highlight Maya Yasanov's book, Edge of Empire, which does dedicate a significant section to Asaf al-Dawla's art collection. And it is also the only scholarship that I've come across so far that goes beyond kind of the art collection itself and really asks the question of why is Asaf al-Dawla collecting art at all, for example. And to summarize her argument in a bit of an oversimplified way, she argues for the nature of Asaf al-Dawla's collecting as an example of a wider Islamic trend, which holds that an impressive royal treasury translates to impressive royal charisma, and so by extension legitimizes the ruler's right to rule. And while I absolutely do not want to dispute the idea that Asaf al-Dawla was engaged in this kind of cultural program designed to legitimize his own rule, and especially given the fact that he had to balance both his nominal loyalty to the Mughal emperor and with the very significant threat, of course, of being absorbed by the British East India Company. So I don't want to dispute that at all. I would like to suggest an additional factor in his collecting habits. And I think this additional factor, I hope it gets a little closer to an answer to the question, why did Asaf al-Dawla collect the works that he did? And why, more than simply the question, why did he collect it all? And so here I want to introduce the key term, which is Ajab. And this is an originally Arabic term meaning wonder that made its way into the Persian language many centuries before the time of Asaf al-Dawla and was in wide use in Persian as well. And since the 1990s, a number of scholars have done important work on this term and the idea of Ajab in the Persian experience of visual art. So it's quite a well-studied concept. I am particularly indebted to the work of Gulu Necipoglu, Persis Berlekamp, and Matthew Saba on this topic. We've made very strong arguments for its relevance at various points during the medieval and the early modern period. Although, of course, by the late 18th century, we are very much at the tail end of that period, if we are even in the early modern period at all. I do want to argue for the continued relevance of Ajab as an aesthetic category in Asaf al-Dawla's art collection specifically, his collecting habits rather. So what is Ajab? I mentioned that it means wonder just now, but in his survey of medieval Arabic dictionaries, Matthew Saba kind of summarizes them by describing Ajab as a desirable feeling that stems from one's own inability to fully comprehend an event, object, or phenomenon because it is perceived as too strange, too great, or too complicated. And I highlighted those words myself, just kind of emphasize those parts of it. So more specifically, actually, here, Ajab is used as a quality by which to measure the excellence of art. And this kind of notion of Ajab, of pleasurable wonder, as a measure of the quality of art it really comes through in a explanation of Ajab by the 11th century grammarian and literary theorist al-Jurjani, who's also quoted by Saba. And I've got the quote here, and he's writing here specifically about a poem in which the petals of a flower are compared to gemstones and flames. But it is equally applicable to the visual arts. And so al-Jurjani says, if a thing manifests from an unknown place or is extracted from an unmined source, then the soul experiences more longing for it, and it is more worthy of the soul's infatuation. The effect of ta'ajjub, so ajab, and finding something strange is similar to when you find something in a place that is not its usual place, or if you discover something that was non-existent or unknown to begin with. If someone were to liken the narcissus to other plants, or granted a likeness with something colorful, you would not find strangeness in it, and this example would not be considered beautiful. So it's really this combination of desirability and inexplicability that made the things that possessed Ajab so important, so desired, really. And it was a favorite subject of the Persian literati. So the most famous book on this subject, on Ajab, is without a doubt Zakaria al-Qazvini's Ajab al-Makhluqat wa al-Ragha'ib al-Mawjudat, which can be translated as the wonders among creation and the curiosities among things. It is a cosmography that discusses the most wonder-inducing things in existence in all of creation. And it was written in 13th century Iran, just before the Mongol invasions. But despite it being so old by the 18th century, it's been a staple of literary culture, essentially uninterrupted from then. And on the right side of the screen, you can see a hand-painted page from a printed book, which was printed in Lucknow in 1866. So several generations actually after the death of Asaf ad-Dawla. And I think the fact that it was printed in Lucknow, and this was very soon after the introduction of lithographic printing in North India, really is a testament to its continued popular appeal, I think, throughout that time period. And in the kind of the introduction to the book, in the book, al-Qazvini himself defines Ajab as follows. He says, Ajab is a state of bewilderment that comes to people due to their incapability of knowing the cause of something. So that's really the concept. Quite a lot has been written about the concept of Ajab and its relevance to the study of the visual experience in the Islamic world, and much of it specifically dealing with the medieval period. So before the rise of the three major early modern empires of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the history of Ajab or its importance in medieval art, but there are a few things that I would like to mention that I think are relevant for the art collection of Asaf ad-Dawla. And the first of these things is the central importance of light to the production of beauty as it is understood by medieval commentators. Ibn al-Haytham, who's an astronomer and a physicist, and who's really known for being one of the first proponents of the idea that vision is not something that is kind of that comes out of your eyes, like rays out of your eyes, but rather it's the consequence of light bouncing off objects, of things in the world, and then being perceived by your eyes. And of course, that's how we understand light today. He made a list of qualities that to him he first of all, he argued that beauty was not an inherent quality of objects. So objects were not beautiful independent of the viewer, which is an idea, which is actually quite an interesting idea in itself. He argued that it's a complex interplay between 22 different qualities, which he then lists. And I won't bore you with the entire list, but he stresses that only two of these qualities, light and color, can create beauty by themselves without the involvement of the other qualities. And of course, he argues also that in his theory of optics, color is a consequence of light. It cannot be perceived without light. So it really, his theory of beauty really centralizes light, and it all comes from light, really. And the second aspect of Ajab that I want to highlight is the importance of the role of the viewer to the quality of art. So whereas with verisimilitude as a measure of the excellence of art, you can, something that we're all familiar with because it's one of the kind of the baselines of Western art. If you've got a portrait, for example, you've got a sitter and you've got the work of art, then how closely it resembles the sitter is one of the qualities by which the quality of the work of art is measured. And in that arrangement, the viewer doesn't really come into play. It doesn't really matter who the viewer is to determine how well a painting resembles its kind of source material. But that's very different from Ajab, because in Ajab, this sense of wonder, it comes from not knowing, and this not knowing is a quality of the viewer. It's not something that's intrinsic to an object. And it's often stressed actually in medieval texts that God, for instance, cannot feel Ajab. There's no, because Ajab is not knowing, he who knows everything cannot experience this Ajab. So that's quite an interesting contrast, I think, and it's worth kind of pointing that out. And we'll see that later on as well. So yeah, this is something that is explicitly discussed by medieval authors themselves. So this is not really, 21st century interpretation of medieval texts. It's really something that's explicitly discussed. And in her work on a collection of late 15th century architectural drawings, known as the Topkapi Scroll, Guru Necipoglu delves quite deep into the why of geometric design, the kind of famous design that I think everyone associates with Islamic art. And when it comes to sight, she knows that medieval commentators, including Ibn al-Haytham, generally distinguish between two ways of seeing. So there's the cursory glance and the kind of the scrutinizing gaze. And of these, the latter is superior in the sense that it's seen as a kind of a visual extension of deep thinking. It's a meditative practice almost. And so from this distinction, it also follows that some objects may be immediately comprehended by a simple glance. For instance, if you have an apple on your desk and you look at it, you can immediately tell this is an apple. You know what it's about. It doesn't pose any deep questions to you. And there is therefore just no need for the scrutinizing gaze. But on the other hand, the experience of Ajab is the bewilderment caused by one's inability to understand something. It forces this scrutinizing gaze. It willfully stops you from just a cursory glance. And if we look at the ceiling here, this is a ceiling of the tomb of Safdarjung, who was the grandfather of Asaf al-Dawla. So, and he died in 1754. So this is quite close to actually I think it's during the lifetime of Asaf al-Dawla, but certainly also close to his reign. And it's something I think that you can see that you can see the willful complication of vision, which Necipoglu cites for older kind of geometric patterns. This kind of idea of like, I can't figure out how it fits together immediately. And even though it's symmetrical in many kind of ways, it does have the kind of the complexity and the kind of it forces you into a closer look, essentially. So what does this mean for the art collection of Asaf al-Dawla? If we go to the next slide, yes. At this point, I would like to give a description of the ainakhaneh, which is actually a description by Maya Jasanov, whom I mentioned earlier. And the reason I want to use her description rather than a kind of a first-hand description is because I think she gets to the kind of the experiential quality of it much more than any of the first-hand accounts do. The first-hand accounts, while they're quite factual, they almost take away their own personal experience of the place and instead focus really on what's there what does this mean for, in a kind of in a moral dimension, what does it mean for the people of Awadh? What does this mean for Asaf ad-Dawla himself? It doesn't really go into like, how do I experience it? But this description does. So that's why I wanted to cite it. And she writes, from floor to ceiling, the ainakhaneh was packed with English objects of all kinds: watches, pistols, guns, glassware, furniture, philosophical machines, all crowded together with the confusion of a lumber room. Giant mirrors multiplied every twinkle of the chandeliers overhead. The space was alive with the whir, tuck, tick, and chime of dozens of clocks and watches. Stunning it absolutely was, and to most Western visitors, in stunningly poor taste. And again, I would be so thrilled to see a painting of the inside of the ainakhaneh, but unfortunately I haven't come across one yet. Instead, there's a painting here. These are all of the swords that you'll see from now on are all in the Wallace collection. I think all kind of, they're representative of the kind of art, the kind of enameled art that was being produced in Lucknow at the time. So you'll note that Jasonov uses the word stunning to describe the collection. And I think you'll agree that the word wonder-inducing could be equally apt in this particular case. Nothing about this description or any of the first-hand descriptions of the ainakhaneh suggests that this is a space that can be taken in with a cursory glance. It's not neat, it's not ordered, it's not kind of easily accessible. Instead, it is a space that forces a scrutinizing gaze with all its mirrors, all its chandeliers, all its the kind of the chaos, the dazzling effects of the light in that space. And I think we should also consider the kind of the equally wonder-inducing quality of objects like watches, like the military technology in this room, which of course to us is old, several hundred years old even, but would have been brand new at the time, and a sign of kind of all the things that new technology can do. And indeed, many of the European visitors, when confronted with these objects, they experience this kind of wonder, which is quite interesting in itself. It's not really perceived as a kind of an aesthetic quality to these visitors, but they certainly do comment on it. And really, they're in a maybe not so desirable way, but they also note their wonder at why are these amazing pieces next to these very ordinary pieces, which is how they saw it. And one of the visitors who noted this odd placement of timepieces was L.F. Smith, who, again, I've cited a few times already. And he wrote the following. He said, "A valuable chronometer, or one which had been sold as such, would be suspended next to a common watch of the most ordinary description, and which indeed had possibly cost the nawabs, so Asaf ad-Dawla, as much as the chronometer. Both toys, having equally amused and deluded the nawab for a few minutes, were consigned to this cabinet, never perhaps to be seen again. From the ceilings were suspended more than 1,000 glass lustres of the most costly description, while a much larger number of wall and table shades were scattered on tables about the rooms." So even in this, I think, quite clearly negative commentary, and of course it's part of a much larger description that is overall quite clearly negative, I think there is still the wonder-inducing qualities of the space still shine through a little bit. And I've also I'm showing here as well the passage that I quoted earlier, so I'm not going to read that out again, but that's the same one we saw earlier. I think it's quite interesting that this moral angle is still apparent in both. But what I really want to highlight is the way European commentators talk about how Asaf ad-Dawla interacts with his collection. And this is, I'm citing one author here, but I would like to stress that this is representative of multiple authors, really the majority of people who write about the collection, about Asaf ad-Dawla and his collection. Well, at first glance, of course, it's very easy to dismiss kind of the childishness which they ascribe to Asaf ad-Dawla as kind of slander or just a general overall negative response to it. I think it becomes quite interesting when you look at it from the angle of Ajab, where the amusement and delusion which L.F. Smith identifies can quite easily be seen as a kind of an appropriate response to art, because by being amused and deluded by something, you're really showing that you're experiencing this wonder at not understanding it. That understanding the art makes it almost worse. So you would not want to show that it's completely comprehensible to you. So I think that's just a little detail that I think is quite interesting. I just want to move on now to the art that was produced at the Lucknow court during this time period. And of all the art that was produced at the court, easily the most discussed in the secondary literature is the work of a handful of European artists who were resident in Lucknow during his reign. And it's not even close. I mean, there's quite a lot of books have been written about this. And one of the most important of them was Johann Zoffany, who we've encountered a few times already by now. And this painting, the Colonel Mordaunt's Cockfight, is probably one of his most famous paintings dealing specifically with India. So Zoffany spends a good amount of time in Lucknow, in India in general, but also in Lucknow. And he was there during Asaf ad-Dawla's reign. This painting is currently in the Tate, and it's on display. It's got a good bit of text. It seems, based on the curation, it seems to be held in quite high regard. And we know that there was at least one other version of this painting. We know that Asaf ad-Dawla owned a version of this painting as well. And they were locally made, so they were made in India. And beyond these paintings, so beyond the ones that were kind of made by European painters there, we also know that Asaf ad-Dawla owned various paintings by European painters who never visited India and who lived in times before Asaf ad-Dawla was alive. So he owned a Claude Lorrain, for example, which unfortunately I've yet to track down. I've not been able to find it so far, but it appears in several textual references. And additionally, we know that Asaf ad-Dawla commissioned and some of his courtiers directly commissioned portraits from resident Europeans, such as Zoffany. So the question with me, right? So at this point, I'm pretty on board with the idea that Ajab may be a significant factor in how art is perceived in 18th century Lucknow. So then I have to wonder, like, okay, but how come they're commissioning this kind of art if this is not the kind of art that is appreciated, if this doesn't meet this kind of this expectation of being wonder-inducing, and instead is very much focused on a realistic perspective? And especially if we move on to the next slide, where we've got the portrait, which is it's a very straightforward portrait in many ways. It's a single person. It's got, the perspective is just kind of straightforward. One would imagine that, given the way he's depicted, it's actually quite an accurate way of depicting Asaf ad-Dawla. One would imagine that he would look like this, and even if it's idealized in some way, it's still kind of, there's a clear reference to him. What's quite interesting here is that we know that he commissioned it. There's a note on the back of the painting which says that it was commissioned by him, by Asaf ad-Dawla. But it also says that it was given to his servant Francis Balazon Thomas. And so, of course, it being commissioned by him is not all that surprising. But what is quite interesting, I think, is that he gave it away. And we know from textual references that it was given away quite soon after being completed. And we know that it was given to Francis Balazon Thomas. And besides this reference, we don't really know very much about him. So this is essentially his biggest claim to fame, is that he was gifted this portrait, which is quite interesting, I think, because it means that Asaf ad-Dawla had this portrait commissioned and then gave it away to someone who was not very important to him. It wasn't the Governor General in Calcutta. It was someone kind of mid-rank in the kind of the court scene, which again suggests that it wasn't really that highly valued as a painting by Asaf ad-Dawla himself or by his courtiers. And this is a trend not just for this particular painting, but also for other portraits commissioned by Asaf ad-Dawla and portraits commissioned by some of his courtiers, that they were often either immediately or fairly soon after re-gifted or gifted to local Europeans, not local other Indian rulers or local courtiers, but really Europeans in India. So to me, just the overview of looking at these paintings really suggests that they are these paintings really stay in a kind of a European circuit, even if they're the occasional buyer, commissioner, seller that is Indian. And the idea that the careers of some of these key European painters in Lucknow during this time period, it was talking about Sofny of the Dilli Kettle, for example, that they were largely unsuccessful is not new. It is pretty well established that they had found most of their success in India with European patrons such as Claude Martin and Antoine Paulier, rather than with the local elites. So my research on this topic is still very much ongoing, and I think there's a lot left to explore. I think in particular, I would like to delve deeper into the Persian and Urdu written material to investigate kind of the contemporary aesthetics. I know that there is a good amount of material out there. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to access, and it's been exponentially more difficult to access it over the last year, of course. And secondly, the kind of the avenue that I'd like to go into further is the establishment essentially of solid provenance for objects that belong to Asaf al-Dawla, because as I mentioned earlier, there are a handful of objects where we know that they were in Asaf al-Dawla's collection and we can trace the entire provenance, but it's really only a handful, and we know that there's so much more out there where we have a good idea that it was in Lucknow, it was there in the late 18th century, and based on how expensive it is, we can be pretty certain that Asaf al-Dawla or one of his richer courtiers owned it. We have no tangible proof, really. So I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk just briefly highlighting some of the works of art that were produced in late 18th century Lucknow, and kind of look at them just in light of the aesthetics of Ajab. And it's not really meant to kind of, prove anything necessarily, but it's just kind of like, does this suggest anything new? Is this new? Is this different angle? Does it produce anything interesting? And just to kind of give context there, in broad terms, the traditional view of Lucknow art of the late 18th century has been that it is more lush and more exuberant than the arts of Mughal Delhi, while also noting that it can often be difficult to draw clear lines between the two, because many of the during Delhi's decline, many of the artists who worked in Delhi moved to Lucknow and essentially just kept working in the same practice. So you'll see a lot of art that is not all that different from Mughal Delhi at the start of it. So it can be quite difficult to draw that line. So, and like Asaf al-Dawla's person, and like the setup of his ainakhaneh, the arts of Lucknow have not had a great reputation certainly not in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, when it was considered a decline from the so-called purity of the 16th and 17th century Mughal art, and it was seen as kind of confusing, kind of hybrid art. And the really where it was appreciated, it was really in it mostly revolved around the kind of the opulence of it, about like how rich it was, how many gemstones it had, how fine the enamels were. And if you look at, of course, this image of a part of a scabbard, so it's a mount of a scabbard, and well, it's quite clear that the enamels are extremely fine. They're really, really well done. So yeah, I want to look a little bit more at some of the works of art in the Wallace collection. The idea of conspicuous consumption has really been centralized, I think, in the scholarship on these works. And they're often, swords like this, scabbards like this, are often described as being ceremonial, but it doesn't really go beyond that. And of course, large chunks of silver, very fine enamel, you've got your velvets, you've got your gold thread, all of that. It is absolutely conspicuous consumption. But I think this description as such doesn't really engage with the idea of like, why is it different from Mughal arts, for example? Why there's quite a clear departure, I think. And why is that? Because the Mughal arts are at least equally valuable and in many cases, very many cases, much more valuable even. So we go to the last slide. I've got here a comparison between two swords, both in the Wallace collection. And they're actually quite close in time. So I purposely chose not to have a kind of a 16th century or an early 17th century Mughal enameled sword or dagger. But I rather instead chose this sword, which is mid 18th century, but it was made in Delhi. And we're quite confident that it was made in Delhi. And it's top of the range. It's very good enamel. And then on the other side, we've got a sword which was made probably a few decades later. It was made in Awadh. And again, it's very fine enamel, but it's really quite different enamel. And there's really two things that I'd like to pick out. One is that the Lucknow enamel chooses to leave the background silver. So actually, the sword on the left, it has a gold ground, and it's enamel on gold. But you can hardly see the gold. You can see it in some of the patterns. The tigers have it, where it's just not enameled. But most of it is covered, and the background is white enamel. It's not clear. So that's one thing. And of course, it embraces the kind of the reflective quality and the kind of the way the light plays with just plain silver rather than a matte enamel. And in that light, I think you can also see that the enamels used themselves, and it's difficult to see, of course, on these pictures. It's much easier to see with the swords in person. Is that the enamels used on the Lucknow sword, especially the blues and greens, which are often considered typical of Lucknow, they are translucent. So you can see the texture of the silver through the blue, and the way the light falls on this blue and on this green, it's really dazzling. It really comes back to you in a very kind of unpredictable, kind of colorful way, in a way that it doesn't really do on these Mughal earlier opaque enamels. So I think these are, I mean, of course, these are just a few objects, but I think it's quite an interesting kind of way of looking at these objects. And I wish I could show you with the actual, by moving them, with reflecting the actual light. I just want to kind of end with a description of a peacock from Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is the first Shia Imam. He's a central figure in Islam, arguably the most important figure in Islam after Muhammad. And he said, among the most wondrous of creation is the peacock. By the way, just you can see, of course, the peacocks here on the Lucknow sword. They're quite a common motif in Lucknow. They're also a common motif in other places. So, don't take too much out of that. But they're certainly a favorite motif. Back to the quote. So, among the most wondrous of creation is the peacock. He flaunts his circling brocade of silver, from which springs the wonder of his halos, of his suns of pure gold, and of the most precious emeralds. He walks with cheerful conceit as he spreads his tail and wings, cackling with delight at the beauty of his garments and the colors of his sword belt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for that really thought-provoking and fascinating lecture. We've got quite a few questions and comments that have come in both via the Q&A and via chat. So hopefully we'll get through them. The first one that came in was from an anonymous attendee who says, wasn't there a magnificent exhibition of the Padshah-nameh in the early to mid 1980s in the Queen's Gallery called the Book of Kings?
Absolutely, it's quite possible. I don't know about that particular exhibition, but and the Padshah-nameh is really one of the most important works of Indian art, arguably ever. And it's been displayed quite a few times. So absolutely. It's been displayed more recently, I think in 2013 as well. So yeah.
Thank you. And then Shani Bassar has asked, isn't the ownership of prestige objects by rulers also a European phenomenon, e.g. the court culture across Europe during the Renaissance?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's not distinct for this period in time or Islamic culture at all. No, it's pretty broad. And actually, many authors make a very convincing argument that conceptually the differences between aesthetics in Islamic culture, medieval Islamic culture, and medieval European culture are not so different.
Thank you. And then Denis Maximov has written in, and excuse my pronunciation if I don't have it correctly, there are centuries-long difference between, is it Nisipogloi's text and the monument that you showed earlier? You showed the ceiling of the monument.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think he's wondering whether you can make some more precise, give more precise examples, perhaps, or more contemporary to the text.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. And I think one of the reasons that, of course, these Guru Netrapoglu really talks about 15th century, the kind of thing, but she talks about these geometric patterns, these designs of things, and it's not so much a kind of a proof that I wanted to present there. It's more, what I was getting at is more that it's a very similar thing is going on here. So it is, if we see the willful complication of vision in the 15th century, and we know that that was a thing then, and we then look at the 18th century architecture, we can see that a very similar thing is going on.
Thank you. And then Anne Hyatt King has an interesting question. The description of the crowded room sounds wonderful. Presumably, if there was ticking and chiming, the clocks and watches were being wound up and cared for.
I would imagine so, yes. Unfortunately, we have so little textual, well, we have textual evidence, but even that is not very much. And we have so little visual evidence as well. So yeah, I would absolutely like to find kind of more descriptions of it, but yeah, I would imagine so.
Thank you. And then Jane Massey is wondering, will the slides be available so we can zoom in to study them more closely, please? Well, of course, we're recording this session, and I think it should eventually go be available. But would you be able to share any images if Jane Massey
Sure.
or anyone else contacts you?
Absolutely, yeah, I'd be happy to.
That's great. Thank you. George Browning asks, is there still a royal palace existing in Oud with relevant collections from Asaf al-Dawla?
The palace is still there in various parts of it are in various states of kind of maintenance. The main thing to know about Lucknow is that it played a key role in the uprising of 1857. And it was essentially sacked at the time, and a lot of objects were presumably lost because obviously we don't really have inventories from prior to that. But yeah, it's not. It doesn't exist in the same way that, for example, collections in Istanbul still exist because of that.
Thanks. And then Jana Elizabeth Mann asks, I think must be referring to the portrait by Zoffany of Asaf al-Dawla, but she says, is the index finger redder than other fingers, and if so, why would that be?
I don't know, I'm afraid. I have no idea. It's possible, I don't know.
Okay, and then Jane Massey is writing in about OA 1398. So the Lucknow sword that you showed, the beautiful sword. Can you tell us about the decoration and especially the birds? Are these usual for Lucknow decoration? Absolutely.
Here, I mean, I specifically chose this sword because it is so representative, essentially, of especially the swords that we have in the Wallace collection, which actually consists of a very large group, an unusually large group of this type of sword. There's also an incredible shield in the Royal collection, which is again Lucknow, late 18th, early 19th century, and has very much the same motifs. So yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. And Elizabeth Atkinson's just written in to say, so enjoyed this talk, thank you. It's given me inspiration to do more follow-up research. Fascinating. This is great. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, do you see a connection between Claude Martin's own great collection, mirrors, watches, clocks, chandeliers, guns, paintings, silver, jewellery, etc., and Asaf ainakhaneh?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite an interesting kind of parallel, and I say it's an interesting thing because I think maybe especially in kind of early 20th century and 19th century, it's I think very much assumed that Asaf al-Dawla in this collecting was very much inspired by Claude Martin. But I think I just want essentially ask the question of what it could be the other way around, I think. And it's nothing from my research, nothing has really suggested that Claude Martin here is the kind of the leading man, and Asaf is following his example. And I think actually the suggestion that it is the other way around could be quite interesting. Also, in kind of light of how Claude Martin engages with India and how, unlike many of his compatriots like Antoine Bollier, like he didn't go back to France. He was much more kind of integrated with, I think, local culture than many of the other people there. So yeah, it's interesting. There's so much more work to be done, to be honest. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this one off the top of your head, but Sarah Thurlbeck asked, what does the calligraphy on the sword OA1398 say?
Oh yeah, good question. These are mostly kind of formulaic kind of inscriptions. I can't see it from on this picture, and I don't know it by heart. But I know there is a what's the word, like a talismanic square. There is kind of invocations, Quranic citations, all of these kinds of things. It is nothing kind of specific to the sword that identifies it as anything.
Right. And Tom Lawrence has written in observation, perhaps some horologists could draw comparisons with late 18th century clock commissions if you consider the Turkish and Chinese export markets, particularly from the UK.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I mean, I would love to hear more about that. Like I said, actually, there is so much work left to be done, I think, on this topic, and I would love to think about that more and do more research on that.
And Emma Coulter has asked, the painting that you said was in the Tate Gallery, can you remind me what it's called and which Tate Gallery it's in? Tate Modern or Tate on Milbank?
It's the Tate Britain.
Yeah, great. Can you give further detail?
Yeah, it's Colonel Morden's Cookfight, and it's in the Tate Britain.
Thank you. Okay, and Shani Bassar says, you mentioned the Asaf al-Awda Asaf al-Awda collected European art. Did this influence local artists?
So I didn't specifically look at this, but we absolutely have. I don't want to call them copies, but they're kind of interpretations of European paintings that are made by local artists in kind of local fashions. So that definitely existed. Yeah, they did. I would say. Yeah, absolutely. I think the answer is yes. But then we're specifically, I think, when it comes to painting. So I don't really want to say that for example, for swords, for example. But yeah, for paint, they absolutely did. A little bit later, I would say, as well. More in the 19th century than in the late 18th century.
Thank you. And I'm going over now to the chat. That was a Q&A. So from the chat, Helen Driver asks, who was L.F. Smith? There's nothing unusual about this kind of eclectic collecting among Indian rulers, especially of European artifacts. yeah, so she's wondering if you can give more information about L.F. Smith, who you quoted earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So he is, there's actually very little information on him. He is someone that was in correspondence with a few people in Calcutta. He was a traveler. Yeah, he traveled, I think from my recollection, he was a company employee specifically. So he traveled from Calcutta to Delhi on company business. He came past Lucknow, of course, on the way there, and then he came back. And actually, description is on the way back. Although it's in the description, it's not entirely clear whether he's describing it from seeing it the first time round or from seeing it kind of the second time round. So it's a little difficult to place, but it would have been it would have been 1795. Certainly, that's where he keeps a diary, so that's kind of where it is.
Thank you. And Helen also wonders what became of this collection during the mutiny.
I don't know. It was scattered. Yeah, it didn't go anywhere specific.
Okay. Robert Graham asks, did Zoffany's portraits and the portraits of other English artists have any influence on Indian portraiture?
Yes, but later on.
Right.
I think I kind of said everything that
yes
in the previous question.
Yeah, thank you. Then Angela Pratiki wonders how many articles you have related to Asaf, or how many objects that you know for sure are associated.
Well, in terms of manuscripts, we've got a handful which are in a royal collection. There's very few objects where we have a definitive, like this was owned by Asaf al-Dawla. And even when it does say that, because there are some examples, it's quite difficult to say to what extent it was owned, because it's often an inscription saying this was gifted to me, whoever owns it, by Asaf al-Dawla, which can mean that it came from his personal collection. It can also mean that he barely saw it and it was something that he just gifted away.
Thank you very much. Patricia Hogarth's written in, I have to read this and endorse it. Thank you, Arthur, for this interesting talk and subject. What a beautiful collection at the Wallace to explore. So we hope people will explore it online, and when we reopen, be able to come in and explore it then as well. Lots of enthusiastic comments like this, and I'm just looking to see if there are any more questions. Yeah, so Daniel Bowen has written in, one point that I would draw attention to is that the two swords from Delhi, OA 1434 and Lucknow OA 1398, actually both contain the same aesthetic elements but differently emphasized. The Delhi sword has the iridescent elements of the quillons, but with a fairly matte crossguard, and the Lucknow sword has the iridescent elements on the crossguard, but with an especially matte set of quillons.
It's interesting. That's a very good point, actually. I would say though that the quillons on the Lucknow piece are also, it's difficult to see in the picture, but they are also translucent. They're really quite iridescent as well. So there's very little matte painting on the Lucknow one, except in the colors that are very difficult to do in kind of a translucent way, such as orange and yellow. But absolutely, and I mean, it's worth noting that, of course, I'm not arguing for any kind of radical break between the two, especially not so close to each other. And so kind of, I mean, these are objects that were made a few decades apart, and also in kind of a very similar milieu, because the Delhi sword was made for the grandfather of Asaf al-Dawla as well, so for Safdarjung as well. So I absolutely don't want to overemphasize difference here.
Thank you. And then Nancy Jenkins asks, is that a green Greek helmet on the OA 1434 sword? That's what it looks like, but it may be that isn't what it is, of course.
No, that's a dragon. That's a dragon's head.
Oh, right, that's great, thank you. And so somebody who was coming in as Denis Maximov, but he's written to say, in fact, his name is Vivek Gupta. Mm-hmm. He has written in with several comments and questions, which I won't go through them all now, but there's one about the notion of wonder as an intellectual enterprise, and the idea of stunning are very different. The two concepts of wonder and stunning don't really map onto each other. He thinks this is a European viewing artworks from afar. Don't know if you've got any comments about that.
No, but of course, but the stunning is not a, I mean, the stunning is a 21st century description. That the specific word is. It's not really about, I mean, that's just an example. It's not, you know, that's just a word that was used in the 21st century.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, so that brings us to the end of the questions we have time for, and we've covered most of them. So I'd just like to thank you, Arthur, again for a really thought-provoking and fascinating talk. Our programme for the History of Collecting seminars for 2021 is now available and has been sent out to people who are on the History of Collecting mailing list. So if you'd like your name and contact details to be added to our History of Collecting mailing list, please contact us at collection@wallacecollection.org. So Wallace Collection, all lowercase, all one word. Our next seminar on the history of collecting will be on Zoom at 5:30 on Monday, the 22nd of February, when Dr. Sarah Ayres, an independent scholar based in London, will give a presentation called Descriptions of Collections and Their Display at the Stuart Court in 1669 in a manuscript account of Prince George of Denmark's Grand Tour. And that Grand Tour was taken between 1668 and 1670. So once again, Arthur, many thanks for your fascinating lecture. And on behalf of the Wallace Collection, thank you very much for attending this seminar. We hope to see you at future seminars and also at other Wallace Collection online events. And of course, when we're able to get back into the museum at in-person events as well. So thank you very much. Good night.